Hello, my little sprout. Come closer and tuck your blanket right up to your chin. There, that's it. Tonight the stars have whispered a special secret just for us. We are going on a grand, golden journey that lasts a whole hour. A journey past the silver cottage of the 7 dwarfs, through the soft, mossy beds of the 3 bears, into a tiny workshop filled with the magic of secret shoes, and deep, deep down into the shimmering blue kingdom beneath the waves. And so, let's begin our journey with the story of Snow White. Once, in a time when the world was silent and draped in the velvet of ancient winters, a queen sat by a window of polished ebony. Outside, the snow fell in large, heavy flakes, like white feathers descending from a quiet sky. The castle was still, save for the crackle of cedar wood in the hearth, and the rhythmic pull of her silver needle through the fabric. As she sewed, she looked out at the frozen garden, where the black branches of the apple trees reached like skeletal fingers toward the grey clouds. For a moment, the needle pricked her finger. 3 drops of blood fell upon the pristine white snow that had gathered on the ebony sill. Looking at the contrast, the deep crimson against the pure frost and the dark wood, the queen whispered a wish to the winter wind. "I wish for a child," she said softly, her breath fogging the glass, "with skin as white as this snow, lips as red as this blood, and hair as dark as this ebony wood. I wish for a child whose heart is as calm as a winter's morning, untouched by the storms of the world." And so it came to be. A daughter was born, and they named her Snow White. She was the light of the stone corridors and the joy of the high towers. But as the seasons turned and the golden light of autumn began to fade into a bitter frost, the good queen passed away. She left the kingdom in a long, quiet twilight, and for many years the king's heart was as heavy as the mountain granite. Years passed, like leaves falling into a deep well. The king took a new wife. She was a woman of statuesque beauty, with a face like a carved diamond, perfect in every line, but cold to the touch. She did not walk, she glided through the halls, draped in gowns of heavy midnight blue velvet, stitched with silver thread that shimmered like frost on a lake. In her private chamber, hidden behind curtains of heavy midnight silk that stifled every sound, stood an ancient artifact. It was not a glass mirror, but a massive disk of polished silver, framed in sleeping serpents of bronze and set with eyes of emerald. This was the Mirror of Truth, a relic from the age of the first mountains, a thing that knew no lies and felt no pity for human vanity. Every morning when the sun had not yet touched the valley, the queen would stand before it. Her shadow stretched long across the cold stone floor, reaching toward the silver disk. She would lift her chin and ask, Mirror, mirror, made of silver and stone, who is the fairest this world has known? And the mirror, in a voice like shifting sand or the grinding of tectonic plates, would answer, "You, my queen, are the fairest of all." And for a time there was peace in her pride. She believed that as long as the mirror spoke those words, time itself would stand still for her. But Snow White was growing, and her beauty was of a different kind. It was not the cold perfection of a diamond, but the living warmth of a spring meadow. By her 14th year, she had become like a summer dawn. She wore simple linen tunics of cream and deep red, and her hair flowed in natural dark waves. She found her joy in the high mountain air and the secrets of the forest. She knew where the first lilies grew and which birds stayed through the winter. The day came when the queen stood before her mirror, expecting the usual tribute. But the silver surface rippled like a disturbed pond. The emerald eyes of the serpents seemed to glow with a strange light. "You, my queen, are fair, it is true. But Snow White beneath the mountain's blue is now 1,000 times fairer than you." The queen's breath hitched. A cold fire ignited in her chest, the fire of envy that consumes the house it inhabits. She summoned her most trusted huntsman, a man with a face weathered like old leather and a heart softened by years of forest silence. She commanded him to take the girl into the great forest, far beyond the stone markers of the kingdom. The huntsman led Snow White deep into the valley, where the giant oaks stood like silent sentinels. But as he looked at the girl, who was picking wild berries and singing softly to the squirrels, his hand began to tremble. He could not do it. He dropped his spear into the moss and fell to one knee. "Run, child," he whispered, his voice cracking like a dry twig. "Run deep into the heart of the mountains, where the queen's shadow cannot reach. The forest is vast, and the stones are ancient. They will protect a pure heart. Go now, and do not look back at the towers of your home." Snow White ran until the castle was but a memory. The forest around her was not dark or cruel, but majestic and ancient. The trees were massive pillars of silver bark, their canopies dripping with golden lichen and emerald moss. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in long, dusty shafts of amber, illuminating the dancing gnats in the air. She walked through ferns as tall as her waist and crossed streams of water so clear they looked like liquid crystal. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged purple peaks of the 7 peaks, Snow White stumbled upon a small, sturdy house. It was built of heavy grey stones and thick cedar logs, tucked into a fold of the mountain, where the air smelled of pine resin and cold mineral water. The roof was covered in thick, green moss, and a warm amber light spilled from the small square windows. Inside, the house was a masterpiece of woodcraft. A long table of polished oak stood in the centre, set with 7 wooden bowls, each carved with the image of a different mountain flower. 7 silver spoons lay ready. Along the wall were 7 small beds, each covered in thick, hand-woven wool blankets of earthy green and brown. Everything was in its place, waiting for the masters of the house to return. Snow White, exhausted by her journey, ate a small spoonful from each bowl and laid across the beds. The silence of the mountain wrapped around her like a warm cloak, and she fell into a dreamless, peaceful sleep. As night fell, the heavy thud of boots on stone echoed outside. The masters of the house returned. They were not children, but the 7 guardians of the peak, ancient miners with braided beards the colour of slate and quartz. They wore leather aprons and carried lanterns that glowed with captured starlight, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. They did not shout when they saw the girl. They stood in a circle, their lanterns raised high. "She is a guest of the mountain," the eldest whispered, his voice deep as a cavern. "The stones have led her here. Let her rest, for her journey was long and the path was steep." When Snow White woke, she found 7 pairs of kind, wise eyes watching her. She told them her story, and the guardians listened in silence, their faces softened by the warm glow of the hearth. They offered her a home, and in return, Snow White brought life to the stone cottage. She learned to bake bread that tasted of mountain honey, and she kept their home bright with wild flowers and polished crystals. "Beware, Snow White," the guardians told her each morning as they departed for the deep mines. "The queen has eyes of silver, and her pride is a long shadow that can stretch across any valley. Do not open the door to anyone, for the world is full of those who offer beauty to hide a hollow heart." Back at the castle, the Mirror of Truth spoke again. The queen learned that the girl lived. 3 times she crossed the mountains in disguise. First, as a woman selling silken laces that cinched too tight around the heart. Second, with a comb of poisoned ebony that brought a sleep like frost. Each time, the guardians returned just in time, their starlight lanterns chasing away the queen's shadow. Finally, the queen came with a gift that looked like the earth itself. An apple, one half red as a sunset, the other white as a cloud. Through the kitchen window, she whispered of peace and friendship. Snow White, who sought only the good in all things, took a bite. The poison was not of death, but of a deep crystalline slumber that froze time itself. The guardians returned to find her still. They could not wake her, but they saw her heart was not gone. It was merely waiting. They could not hide her in the dark earth, so they crafted a resting place of clear quartz and mountain gold. They placed it in a sunlit glade where the mountain eagles watched from above, and the deer came to rest. A young prince, A traveller who studied the wisdom of the high paths found the glade. He did not seek a bride, nor did he come with a sword. He came with a book of ancient songs. He recognized the peace in Snow White's face, a peace he had been searching for in all his travels. He stayed with the guardians, helping them guard the glade through the changing seasons. One day, as they moved the quartz bed to a more sheltered part of the glade, the piece of apple was shaken loose. Snow White opened her eyes, and the forest seemed to exhale a long-held breath. There was no battle, no anger. The prince took her hand, and together with the 7 guardians, they walked back toward the valley, under a sky of gold and violet. The queen looked into her silver mirror one last time, but the disk had turned black. Her envy had finally blinded her, and she realized that true radiance cannot be stolen or manufactured. It is a light that grows only in a heart at peace. She spent the rest of her days in the quiet towers, learning to find beauty in the simple shadows. Snow White and her prince brought the wisdom of the mountains to the people of the valley. And they lived not just happily, but in a state of lasting, golden peace, where every winter was followed by a spring of infinite hope. Sweet dreams, my little one. The stars are watching over you. As the forest birds settle quietly into their nests and the stars shine a little brighter, let's wander just a bit deeper into the woods. Look, do you see that cozy little house among the trees? It smells of warm honey and sweet porridge. Let's see who lives inside with the story of Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. Once upon a time, in a quiet valley where the morning mist clung to the grass like a soft silver blanket, lived a little girl named Goldilocks. She was called this because her hair was the colour of fresh straw, shining with a pale golden light even on the cloudiest of days. She lived in a small, sturdy cottage with a thatched roof and windows that sparkled like diamonds in the sun. The cottage stood right at the very edge of an ancient, magnificent forest. This was a place of deep peace. The trees were massive, with bark as thick and wrinkled as an elephant's skin, and roots that travelled deep into the dark, cool earth. High above, their branches wove together to create a ceiling of emerald leaves, through which the sunlight fell in long, slow beams, illuminating tiny dust motes dancing in the air. One quiet afternoon, the air was filled with the scent of wild thyme and sun-warmed pine needles. Goldilocks' mother handed her a small basket woven from dried willow branches. "My dear," her mother said, her voice as gentle as a lullaby, "would you go into the woods and gather some blueberries for our evening meal? But listen closely. Stay where the sun touches the path and do not wander where the shadows grow long." Goldilocks nodded, her golden curls bouncing softly. She stepped into the cool shade of the forest. The ground was cushioned with deep green moss that felt like a thick carpet under her feet. For a long time, she was content. She watched a family of tiny wood mice scurrying under a fern, and she listened to the rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker high in a cedar tree. The blueberries were everywhere, dark, plump, and covered in a dusty blue mist. As she picked the berries, dropping them one by one into her basket with a satisfying thump, she found herself following a trail of the largest, sweetest fruit. She moved slowly, step by step, deeper into the heart of the woods. The air became cooler, and the silence became deeper, broken only by the soft rustle of her dress against the tall grass. By the time her basket was full, the sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon. The golden light turned into a rich, honey-colored amber, and the long shadows of the trees stretched out like fingers across the moss. Goldilocks stopped and looked around. The familiar path was nowhere to be seen. The great forest, while beautiful, now felt vast and mysterious. She realized she had wandered much further than she intended. But as she began to feel the first flicker of worry, a wonderful, comforting scent drifted through the trees. It was the smell of toasted oats, wildflower honey, and a hint of warm cinnamon. It was a smell that spoke of home and safety. Following the scent, she stepped into a hidden clearing. In the center stood a house unlike any she had ever seen. It was built from heavy silver-grey logs, and its roof was a thick velvet layer of green moss and tiny white flowers. The window frames were carved with patterns of leaves and acorns, and a warm orange glow flickered behind the glass. It looked like a place where kindness lived. Goldilocks walked to the heavy oak door. It was beautifully carved, with the image of a great sun rising over a forest. She knocked, the sound echoing softly in the quiet clearing. "Hello?" she called, her voice small and polite. "Is anyone home? I have lost my way." No one answered. The door, heavy but perfectly balanced, swung open just an inch. Goldilocks, hoping to find a friendly face and perhaps a bit of warmth, pushed the door open and stepped inside. She stood in the entryway, breathless with wonder. The interior was a masterpiece of woodcraft. The floors were made of wide, polished planks that caught the light of the fire crackling in a massive stone hearth. In the center of the main room stood a magnificent table, carved from a single giant trunk of a cherry tree. The wood was a deep reddish brown and shone with the soft luster of beeswax. On the table sat 3 bowls. The first was a massive basin of dark, rough-hewn oak. The second was a medium-sized bowl made of fine, polished birchwood. The third was a tiny, delicate bowl carved from white maple, smooth as a river stone. Steam rose from each bowl in slow, lazy swirls. Goldilocks was so very hungry. She picked up a heavy wooden spoon and tried a sip from the great oak bowl. "Oh," she whispered, the sound muffled by the thick walls. "This porridge is much too hot." It felt like the midday sun. She moved to the birchwood bowl and took a sip. "Oh," she said, shaking her head gently, "this porridge is much too sweet." It tasted as if a whole hive of bees had emptied their honey into it. Finally, she took a small spoon and tried the porridge in the tiny maple bowl. She closed her eyes. It was perfect. It was creamy, warm, and tasted of the forest and the fields. It was the most wonderful meal she had ever had. She ate every single drop, scraping the bottom of the little white bowl until it was clean. Feeling full and a bit sleepy, she looked toward the fireplace. There stood 3 chairs, each a work of art. The largest was a throne of dark walnut, with a back so high it reached toward the ceiling. Goldilocks climbed into it, but the wood felt cold and the seat was as hard as a rock. "This chair is too firm," she sighed. The middle chair was made of curved willow branches and filled with thick, woolly cushions. She sat down and immediately sank so deep she could hardly see over the arms. "This chair is too soft," she mumbled. Then she saw the smallest chair. It was carved from light ash wood, with a seat woven from soft rushes. She sat down, and it fit her perfectly. She felt the warmth of the fire on her face and began to relax. But as she leaned back, a soft, tired snap came from the wood. One of the delicate legs gave way, and Goldilocks tumbled gently onto the soft sheepskin rug. She felt a pang of guilt for the broken chair, but her exhaustion was now so great that she could barely keep her eyes open. She saw a set of stairs made of split logs and followed them up to a quiet loft. There, under the sloping roof, were 3 beds. The first was a massive frame of heavy pine, covered in a quilt of thick, dark wool. It was too high and too heavy. The second was a bed of carved cedar with a duvet of many-coloured silks. It was too fluffy and made her feel as if she were floating away. The third bed was a simple frame of pale birch. It was covered in a light, soft blanket that smelled of dried lavender and summer wind. Goldilocks lay down, and the mattress seemed to hug her. Within seconds, she was in a deep, dreamless sleep. Her golden hair spread across the pillow like a halo. While she slept, the owners of the house returned from their walk. They were not the wild bears of the deep, dark woods, but the wise guardians of the forest. They wore tunics of woven flax and moved with a quiet, heavy grace. Papa Bear was as tall as a young oak, with fur the colour of charcoal. Mama Bear had eyes like amber beads and fur the colour of autumn leaves. Baby Bear was small and round, with a curious nose that was always twitching. They entered their home and immediately felt a change in the air. Papa Bear looked at the great cherry-wood table. "Someone has been tasting my porridge," he said, his voice like the low rumble of distant thunder. Mama Bear looked at her birchwood bowl. "Someone has been tasting my porridge too," she said, her voice like the rustle of wind in the pines. Baby Bear looked at his empty maple bowl. "Someone has been tasting my porridge," he squeaked, "and they have eaten it all up." They moved to the hearth. Papa Bear looked at his walnut throne. "Someone has been sitting in my chair," he observed calmly. "And someone has been sitting in my chair too," said Mama Bear, touching the disturbed cushions. Baby Bear held up a piece of the broken ash wood. "Someone has been sitting in my chair," he said sadly, "and now it is broken." The bears did not grow angry. They were wise and knew that only someone very small and very lost would seek shelter this way. They moved silently up the log stairs. One by one, they looked at the beds. "Someone has been sleeping in my bed," whispered Papa Bear. "Someone has been sleeping in my bed too," whispered Mama Bear. Baby Bear crept to the edge of the smallest bed. "Look," he whispered. "Someone is sleeping in my bed right now." The soft sound of their breathing woke Goldilocks. She opened her eyes to see 3 large, kind faces looking down at her. She didn't see claws or teeth. She saw the deep, patient wisdom of the woods. "I am so sorry," Goldilocks said, her voice trembling as she sat up. "I was lost, and I was hungry, and I was so very tired. I did not mean to break your chair." Papa Bear knelt down, his massive form filling the room with a sense of safety. "Do not weep, little one," he said. "The forest is wide, and even the brightest sun can lose its way behind the clouds. You are safe here." Mama Bear smiled and reached out a soft paw to pat Goldilocks's hand. "Your mother is likely searching the edges of the woods for you. The moon is full and bright. We will show you the way home." Goldilocks helped Baby Bear gather the pieces of the broken chair, promising that her mother would help them fix it. Then the 4 of them, the giant bear, the graceful mother bear, the little cub, and the golden-haired girl, walked through the moonlit forest. The silver light turned the trees into pillars of salt and the moss into a sea of grey velvet. When they reached the edge of the valley, they saw the golden lantern of Goldilocks' mother swinging in the dark. "Goldilocks! Goldilocks!" she cried out. When the mother saw her daughter emerging from the trees with the legendary guardians of the forest, she fell to her knees in relief. Goldilocks ran to her, and they embraced for a long, long time. Goldilocks explained everything: the hunger, the house, the porridge, and the kindness of the bears. Her mother, her heart full of gratitude, looked at the 3 bears standing tall and noble in the moonlight. "You have kept my daughter safe," the mother said. "Please, the night is cold and you have travelled far. My table is set, and though I have only simple stew and fresh bread, I would be honoured if you would share it with us." The bears bowed their heads in thanks. They followed the mother and daughter into the small cottage. It was a wonderful sight. The great bears sitting on the floor around the small table, their large paws carefully holding the mother's ceramic bowls. They ate fresh bread crusted with seeds and a hearty stew of roots and herbs. Goldilocks sat next to Baby Bear, and they shared a bowl of sweet, fresh blackberries, the very ones she had picked earlier. And Goldilocks' mother showed the bears how to mend a wooden chair using strong glue and twine. That night, Goldilocks learned that while it is important to follow the path, it is even more important to be brave enough to say, "I am sorry." And the bears learned that a human home could be just as warm and welcoming as a hidden house in the woods. From that evening on, the golden light of the cottage and the silver light of the forest house were always connected by a path of friendship. And they all lived in peace and harmony for many, many years to come. The end. As the three bears fall into a deep, peaceful sleep in their little house, let's follow the moonlight as it dances over the treetops and into a quiet village street. There, in a tiny workshop filled with the scent of soft leather and polished wood, something very special is about to happen in the middle of the night. It is a story of kindness and hidden wonders, called The Secret Gift, the Elves and the Shoemaker. Once, in a time when the world moved to the rhythm of the seasons and the soft, steady ticking of grandfather clocks, there lived an honest shoemaker. His name was Anton. He lived with his wife, Martha, in a small, timber-framed house tucked away at the edge of a village where the cobblestone streets always smelled of wood smoke, roasting chestnuts, and the clean scent of winter rain. Anton was a man of quiet dignity. His hair was as silver as a winter's mist, and his hands were weathered by decades of pulling waxed thread through tough hide. He was a craftsman of the old world, a man who believed that every stitch held a piece of the maker's soul. "A shoe is not just leather and nails, Martha," he would often say, his eyes twinkling behind round spectacles. "It is a promise of a safe journey." But times were hard. The winter of that year had been long and bitter. The mountain passes were blocked by snow, and the people of the village had little gold to spend on new boots. They patched their old soles until there was nothing left to patch. One by one, Anton's rolls of leather dwindled. He didn't complain, but at night he would stare at his ledger with a heavy heart. One cold Tuesday evening, as the sun dipped behind the jagged purple peaks of the mountains, leaving only a bruise-coloured light in the sky, Anton sat at his workbench. The only light came from a single tallow candle, its flame dancing in the draught that whistled through the gaps in the window frame. Martha entered, carrying a small bowl of thin soup. "Is that the last of it, Anton?" she asked softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "The very last, my dear," Anton replied, adjusting his spectacles. He looked down at the piece of leather, a beautiful, deep mahogany hide, supple and rich. Enough for 1 pair of shoes. If I do not sell these by Friday, I don't know how we shall buy flour for the Christmas bread." He took his heavy iron shears. With a hand that didn't tremble despite his hunger, he carefully cut out the pieces, the vamps, the quarters, and the soles. He was too tired to sew them that night. He laid them neatly on his bench, side by side, like a puzzle waiting to be solved. "I will rise at dawn," he whispered. "The morning light is honest. It will guide my needle." He blew out the candle, and as the smoke curled into the darkness, he left the workshop to the silence of the frost. The next morning, the world was encased in a shell of silver ice. Anton washed his face in freezing water, said his morning prayers, and entered the workshop. He expected to find the cut-out pieces of leather just as he had left them, cold and lifeless. But as he approached the bench, he stopped dead in his tracks. His jaw dropped. There, sitting exactly where the mahogany leather had been, was a pair of shoes. They were not just finished, they were masterpieces. Anton picked one up, his fingers trembling. Each stitch was so small and even it was almost invisible. The leather had been polished to a luster so deep it looked like dark water under a summer sun. "Martha! Martha, come quickly! Look at this!" Martha hurried into the room, wiping her hands on her apron. She gasped, clutching her chest. "Anton, when did you finish them? I didn't hear the hammer." "I didn't," Anton whispered, turning the shoe over. "Look at the welt. Look at the heel. It's perfect, not a single flaw. It is as if they were sewn by the fingers of a spirit." Suddenly the shop bell chimed. It was the village mayor, a man of great girth and even greater ego, known for his love of fine things. He marched in, his nose in the air. "Shoemaker, I need boots for the winter ball. Something to show my status." His eyes fell upon the mahogany shoes. He grabbed them, examining the work. "By the stars! I have travelled to the capital, but I have never seen such craftsmanship. These aren't shoes. They are jewels for the feet." The mayor didn't even ask the price. He threw a heavy purse of gold coins onto the table, triple what Anton usually charged. "Make me more. I want boots for my wife and my daughters." With the mayor's gold, Anton was able to buy leather for 2 more pairs. That evening, he cut the pieces again. And again the next morning, 2 pairs of boots stood ready. One pair was a delicate forest green, and the other a sturdy black with silver eyelets. Night after night, the miracle repeated. Anton would cut, and the invisible hands would sew. The fame of the mysterious shoemaker spread like wildfire. People travelled from distant towns, merchants, knights, even a duchess, just to see the shoes that seemed to be sewn by the wind itself. Anton and Martha were no longer hungry. Their larder was full of honey, white flour, smoked ham, and fresh milk. But Anton remained a humble man. He didn't buy a carriage or a palace. He stayed in his small house, still cutting the leather himself, still honouring the craft. One evening, as Christmas Eve drew near, the snow began to fall in large, heavy flakes, draping the world in a velvet white silence. Anton sat by the hearth, watching the embers glow. "Martha," he said, his voice reflecting the firelight, "we have been blessed. Our debt is gone, our bellies are full, but my soul is restless. I cannot go another year without knowing who our friends are. I want to thank them. Shall we stay awake tonight and watch?" Martha nodded, her eyes bright. "I have prepared a pot of tea and hidden it behind the curtain. Let us see who works while the world sleeps." They lit no candles. The workshop was bathed in the pale, ghostly light of the full moon, reflecting off the snow outside. The clock on the wall, tick, 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 seemed louder than usual. They hid behind a heavy velvet curtain in the corner, holding their breath. Then, just as the village bell tolled midnight, the air in the room seemed to shimmer. A tiny golden light appeared, spinning like a moth around the workbench. Through the cracks in the floorboards and the shadows of the eaves, two tiny figures emerged. They were elves, no taller than a spool of thread. They were quite bare, their skin pale as cream, wearing nothing to protect them from the winter chill. With a nimbleness that defied the eye, they leaped onto the workbench. They didn't speak in human words, but their laughter sounded like tiny silver bells. "Look, Flicker, fine leather today, mahogany and gold," said one. "Quick, Needle, the sun won't wait for slow stitches. Tap, tap, so, replied the other. They picked up the awls and the needles. Their little hands moved like hummingbirds. Tap, tap, tap went the tiny hammers. Swish, swish, swish went the silk thread through the hide. They danced as they worked, skipping over the shears and sliding down the rolls of leather. Behind the curtain, Martha gripped Anton's hand. Her heart ached. These tiny creatures were working so hard, providing for them, yet they had nothing but their own joy to keep them warm. The elves finished the last stitch, polished the leather with a tiny piece of silk, and poof! They vanished back into the shadows as the first light of dawn touched the window pane. "Anton," Martha whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "They have given us our life back, and yet they have nothing, not even a shirt to keep out the frost. I want to make them something." "And I," Anton replied, his heart swelling. "I will make them shoes, not for sale, but for love." For the next few days, the workshop was a hive of secret, joyous activity. Martha used her finest needles and most delicate linen. She sewed 2 tiny shirts, 2 pairs of trousers made of soft blue wool, and 2 little coats with gold buttons. She even knitted stockings no bigger than a thimble. Anton worked with his smallest tools. He chose the softest kidskin leather, red as a robin's breast. He crafted shoes so tiny they could fit on a man's thumb, complete with tiny buckles of real silver. On Christmas Eve, instead of the usual cut-out lever, they laid the gifts on the workbench, 2 complete outfits arranged neatly under the moonlight. Then they hid. At midnight, the elves arrived. They skipped onto the bench, expecting work. But when they saw the clothes, they stopped. They tilted their heads. They touched the soft wool and the shining leather. "Clothes for us! Shoes for us!" they chirped. They dressed with lightning speed. They pulled on the stockings, buttoned the coats, and stepped into the silver-buckled shoes. They looked at their reflection in Anton's polished shears, posing and bowing to one another. They began to sing a song of pure happiness, a melody that felt like starlight made sound. They danced over the table, over the stools, and even did a somersault over the inkwell. "Now we are boys, so fine and neat. Why shoe the world with weary feet?" They danced out through the window, leaving a trail of golden dust that sparkled in the moonlight like falling stars. The elves did not return the next night. Anton and Martha waited, but the workbench remained empty of magic. At first there was a quiet loneliness in the shop. But as Anton picked up his tools the next morning, he realized something. His hands didn't feel heavy anymore. The leather felt more supple. The thread seemed to glide. The elves hadn't left because they were finished with him. They had left because they had restored his spirit. They had reminded him that he was a master and that kindness is the greatest currency of all. Anton and Martha lived a long and very happy life. They were never poor again. For every pair of shoes Anton made from that day forward seemed to carry a bit of that midnight magic. People said that whoever wore Anton's shoes walked a little lighter, felt a little braver, and always found their way home. The wisdom the elves left behind was clearer than any gold. Work done with love attracts the help of the heavens, and gratitude is the bridge that lets magic cross into our world. And so the workshop remained warm, the leather remained plentiful, and the memory of the golden dust stayed in their hearts forever. The fire is low now, my little one. The stars are watching over you, tucked in their blanket of night. The world is full of quiet magic, waiting for those who work with love. Sweet dreams. Sleep well. As the little elves finish their work and slip away into the night, let's follow the silver moonbeams down to the edge of the deep blue sea. Close your eyes and listen to the gentle, rhythmic lap of the waves as we dive into our very last story of the night, a tale of shimmering scales and sea foam called The Little Mermaid. Sit a little closer, my dear. Today, I will tell you a story about a world that never sees the sun in the way you do every morning. Far away, where the water is so deep that no ship's anchor has ever touched the bottom, lies the kingdom of our brothers, the people of the sea. There, where silence and deep blue water rule, our story begins. In the middle of this kingdom stood the Sea King's palace. It was not built of stone or brick, but of the most beautiful corals that had grown for thousands of years. The windows were made of pure amber, and through them the light shone like a warm honey. It was so bright and beautiful that even the smallest fish would stop to swim in its glow. The king had 6 daughters. Each of them was beautiful, but the youngest was special. She was as soft as a lily petal, with eyes as blue as the deepest part of the ocean, and hair that floated in the water like threads of gold. She did not have legs like people on land. She had a fish tail that shimmered with silver and pearl light. While her older sisters loved to play with treasures from sunken ships, the little mermaid loved something else. She had a secret garden. She did not care for gold or statues. She had only one sea rose, as red as the setting sun, which she cared for with great love, as if it were the only spark of life in her cold, deep world. According to the ancient laws of the deep, each princess was granted the right to visit the surface only upon reaching her 15th birthday. Her sisters had already ascended one by one, returning with whispers of the world above. Finally, the day arrived for the youngest princess. When it was finally her turn, she swam up. The water above her became clearer and clearer. She broke through the surface like an arrow and stood still. She had never seen anything so big as the sky or so bright as the sun. And there, on the water, in the light of the sunset, a large wooden ship was rocking gently. She watched the people on the ship. They were not monsters, but people who were singing and dancing. Then she saw him. On the deck stood a young prince. He had dark eyes and a smile that made the little mermaid's heart beat faster than ever before. It was not a happy feeling, but a strange, quiet worry, like the taste of salt and the feeling of a fabulous change. Night fell quickly, covering the sea like a dark blue blanket. The ship lit up with lamps and music filled the air. Each note felt like a gentle touch on her heart. She stayed in the shadows, watching the prince walk among his crew, and in his eyes she saw the stars that she could never reach. But then the sea began to change. The wind, which had been a soft whisper, became a loud roar. The waves, which had been gentle, began to grow like black mountains. The little mermaid watched as the beautiful ship became a toy in the hands of the angry ocean. People shouted, and the water crashed loudly. She saw the tall mast of the ship break like a dry twig. The ship began to sink into the dark water. The prince was now in the water. He was fighting the waves that tried to pull him down to the deep, quiet, dark. Without thinking, she swam to save him. The water was very cold and the currents were strong. She had to keep him above the surface. His skin was cool and his breathing was terribly slow. She swam with him for a long time until she felt sand beneath her. They had reached a sandy shore, a new world that she knew she could not stay in. She left him there on the soft sand where the water could not reach him, and hid behind some rocks and waited until he opened his eyes. When young girls from a nearby school found him, she knew she had to leave. She looked at his face one last time, and then she dived back into her blue, silent home. From that day on, she was not the same. Her garden felt smaller, and the pearls in the palace lost their shine. She felt a deep sadness, a longing that stayed with her. She began to ask her grandmother questions that were forbidden. Can people live forever? Do they have souls that stay after they pass away? Or do they just turn into sea foam? The grandmother looked at her with sadness. She explained that people have short lives, but their souls fly high above the sea and the stars. Mermaids, even though they live for 300 years, turn into sea foam on the waves when they die, becoming just a quiet memory that melts in the morning light. The little mermaid could not accept this. She wanted what the prince had, a soul that does not disappear. And the only way to get one was through the love of a human. Not just any love, but a love where a human promises to marry a mermaid, giving her a part of his own soul. She went to see the sea witch. It was a place everyone feared, a cave full of shadows where the water was thick with old magic. The witch, a creature as old as the sea, laughed when she saw the mermaid. She knew why she had come, and she knew the price. "I will give you what you want," the witch said, and her voice sounded like ice cracking. "But every step you take on land will feel like walking on sharp knives. You will feel pain with every move. And if the prince marries someone else, the day after his wedding, you will turn into sea foam, disappearing with the first light of the sun." It was a terrible price, but the mermaid did not hesitate. Could there be anything worse than living without a goal, without love, without the chance for a soul? The witch reached out for her voice. The mermaid had to give it away, her only way to speak. When she drank the magic drink, she felt a sharp pain, as if a sword had cut through her body. When she woke up, she was on the land. Her tail was gone, and she had legs, just as she had wished. They were slim and white, but when she tried to stand, it felt as if she were walking on sharp glass. The pain was very great, But when she saw the prince walking toward her, she smiled. It was her most painful triumph. The prince brought her to his castle. He did not know who she was. He did not know that she had saved his life. She became his quiet friend, his loyal shadow. She danced for him, even though every step was like a knife, and her feet left marks that looked like beauty to others but were signs of her great love to him. Days passed, and he still looked for the girl from the school, believing she was the one who had saved him. The little mermaid watched as his heart looked for someone else, even though she was right there. Could anyone love more than she did? Could anyone give more? The silence she had chosen was the loudest cry this kingdom had ever heard. Finally, the day of his wedding to another arrived. The ship was full of flowers, and music played over the sea, signaling the end of her hope. The little mermaid stood on the deck, feeling the pain in her legs grow worse. She knew this was the end. With the first ray of sun that would rise, her life would turn into foam, a quiet sound on the edges of the world. Her sisters swam up from the deep, holding a dagger they had received from the witch in exchange for their beautiful hair. "Touch him with this," they whispered, "and you will break the spell. Your legs will turn back into a tail, and you will come back to us." But the little mermaid, looking at the prince sleeping beside his new wife, knew she could not take his happiness away. She kissed him on the forehead one last time and threw the dagger far into the dark waves. There was no more pain in her, only a quiet, peaceful heart. As the sun began to rise above the horizon, she felt her body become light. She began to melt, not into pain, but into clear, bright air. She had become one of the daughters of the air. She did not disappear into foam, as the witch had promised. Her love and her sacrifice gave her something more than a soul. She became part of the wind that blows over the earth, part of the rain that gives life, and part of every sunset that makes children wonder. Now, when you feel the wind, know that it is her, our little mermaid, who has finally found her home. And so, my little one, you see that true love is not about what we can keep for ourselves, but about what we are willing to give away. It teaches us that even when things seem to end, they might be turning into something new and beautiful, something that stays with us forever. Now, close your eyes and let the gentle wind tell you the rest of the story in your dreams. Sleep well, my dear.